So I think we're going to get started. I would again say if you are brave enough to come forward, I know that would be nice to see everybody a little bit closer. So good morning. My name is Erica Zalewski, and I am a research analyst in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on subsidized jobs for youth. I also want to welcome our virtual attendees who are watching via live stream. Welcome. So we have a really great panel lined up for you with 3 interesting presentations and a terrific discussant. But I do want to take just a minute to talk a little bit about ACF's interest in this area and some work that we're currently doing. Subsidized employment broadly is of great interest to ACF. It's also great interest to the federal government. We, along with our partners at the Department of Labor, are undertaking some really exciting new evaluation work around subsidized employment and transitional jobs, specifically the enhanced transitional jobs demonstration that the Department of Labor is doing, as well as our subsidized and transitional employment demonstration. It shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody here, but I think the interest in subsidized employment really sort of reemerged or got a little bit reinvigorated with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and the TANF Emergency Fund. We saw a lot of excitement at the state level about providing subsidized jobs to both adults and youth. It's worth noting that about half of the jobs provided under the ECF were specifically for youth. So this topic today kind of combines our interest in subsidized employment broadly, but also our interest in helping disconnected and at-risk youth. The recession was very hard on lots of people, but I think it was especially difficult and continues to be very difficult for youth who may be disconnected from school or work or at risk of not having self-sufficient outcomes. So we're very anxious and eager to learn more today, as well as in our ongoing work, about what we can do to better help this population. I do want to mention, and I know you're going to hear about it again, but I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't mention that we are looking at some youth subsidized employment programs in our subsidized and transitional employment demonstration. So their bios are in your program book, so I don't want to take up any more time going through all of that, but I did just want to quickly introduce our panel and then let them tell you all about what they're doing. First, we have Carson Hicks. She is the Director of Programs and Evaluation for the New York City Center for Economic Opportunity, and she's going to discuss CEO's work on subsidized jobs for youth. We're thrilled to have CEO's work here. You guys are really great innovators, and we're excited to have you talk about it today. Then we're going to hear from Courtney Hawkins. She is the Senior Vice President of Education, Youth, and Workforce Initiatives at FEG's Health and Human Services System, and she's going to give you a provider's perspective on how to offer sort of subsidized employment services for youth. Clyde McQueen serves as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Full Employment Council, and he's going to share his experiences implementing the Social Innovation Fund's Project RISE program in Kansas City. And last but certainly not least, and someone that I have the pleasure of working with quite frequently, is Dan Bloom. Dan directs the Health and Barriers to Employment policy area at MDRC. He's also the project director for both of the studies that I mentioned, both DOL's transitional job study as well as our STED project. And he's truly an expert in this area, and we're very glad to have him be our discussant. So with that, I will turn it over to Carson.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Glad everyone can be here. Before I get into our subsidized jobs program, I want to give you a little background about CEO for those of you who may not be familiar with the work that we do. So in 2006, Mayor Bloomberg convened a bunch of people from the philanthropic, academic, business communities to really take a look at what more could be done for poverty in New York City. Obviously, this was a very different economic climate at the time. However, we still had 20+% poverty in New York. So the idea was what more could be done. How do we tackle poverty in a more efficient way? The Center for Economic Opportunity was established to bring forth the recommendations of the commission. We have a $100 million innovation fund that is comprised of public and private dollars. This is an annual fund. It supports the pilot programs that we do, as well as evaluation, which when the commission convened and came forth with their recommendations, evaluating things to see what works, so to speak, was really core. So we have a dedicated pot of money for evaluation efforts. So each of our initiatives are in fact evaluated. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also conduct rigorous performance monitoring, tracking process and outcome metrics to really have an understanding of what's going on with programs in real time. Okay, so a little bit about how we work. We're located within the Office of the Mayor, within New York City. That's the innermost circle. We do program development, design, et cetera. We partner with city agencies. That's the middle circle. So for example, many of our subsidized jobs programs are with our Department of Youth and Community Development or Human Resources Association, who I see represented in the audience there. They in turn issue the request for proposals to the community providers who provide the direct services for these programs. So in addition to that, we work with 9 independent evaluation firms, one of which is MDRC, which is well represented here today. They each sort of specialize in different things or are just general focus. So for an example, we also work with Vera Institute of Justice, who often will do criminal justice evaluations for our programs. We've worked with about 200 providers each year, and to date we've served about 450,000 people in general with our programs. So getting into our youth development strategies, clearly subsidized jobs is a component, but we also, over the years, have sort of identified that education is very important. Many of our young people, particularly those who are disconnected, do not have a high school diploma or GED, let alone college or anything else. And then case management is very important in terms of reducing barriers to program retention and just generally helping young people. I want to take a quick moment to talk about the statistics in New York City. So we have about over 1 million young people who are between the ages of 16 and 24. About 11% of those are out of school and out of the labor market entirely. And then somewhere between 16 and 17% are out of school and out of work. So really a rather large population. There are not enough services to go around, not enough programming. So really this is important. And about half of our overall investments over the years have been targeting young people who are either disconnected or at risk. This just sort of shows our investments over the years. We all know that the research shows that early work experience is exceptionally important for young people. With the economy tanking, our young people were in the back of the line. We're not actually getting the jobs, so we really think that subsidized employment for them is really good to help them get that early work experience. The graph basically just shows that over time we really have bumped up our investment in this area. So in FY12, approximately $60 million. We see subsidized employment as a hook to engage these young people. Very often they need money in their pocket, so they will come in for that reason, and then it's an opportunity to also offer them services such as education or case management. So the first program I'm going to talk about is our Young Adult Internship Program. This was the first subsidized job program that CEO piloted. It started in 2007. It's a partnership with our Department of Youth and Community Development. So if we think of disconnected youth as a spectrum where 1 are the most job ready and 10 are the ones with the most barriers, this would be targeting youth who are the most job ready. I'll talk about other programs that focus on those with the most barriers. To enter the program, you have to be between the ages of 16 and 24, and you have to be reading at a minimum of a 6th grade reading level. We use that as a proxy for very basic job readiness. We did some preliminary evaluation work for this program. We found that it was very promising in terms of connecting disconnected youth. We've had very good outcomes in terms of internship completion, placements, and then subsequent retention 9 months after the program, which I'll talk about in the next slide. This is a program that has also been expanded through the Young Men's Initiative, which for those of you who are not familiar with it was launched in 2011. In New York City. It was designed to reduce disparities between young Black and Latino men and their peers in the areas of employment, education, health, and criminal justice. So a handful of programs, CEO programs were replicated through this, and then about 50 new programs were launched, and CEO is overseeing the program implementation, management, and evaluation of these programs. So YAIP, as we refer to it, was one of the programs. So as I said, very good outcomes, very promising in terms of really reconnecting disconnected youth. We're also terribly, terribly excited that YAIP is going to be part of the study that Erica referenced, the STED study on subsidized employment that's being conducted by MDRC. It is the first young adult program that's going to be part of the study, and the evaluation is a random assignment evaluation, which will begin for this particular program in July. And of course, Dan, who's the PI, can answer a lot more questions about it, but we're just absolutely thrilled because it really focuses attention not only on this population, but on these types of programs. Next up is our Works Progress program. This really evolved out of recognizing that there are lots of community-based organizations that are providing many, many services for young people, such as education, job readiness, et cetera, but can't really afford to offer paid internships. So we partnered with the Human Resources Administration, in New York City to create the Works Progress program, which really reimburses providers just for internships. They need to be providing existing services, and then they're reimbursed. So we love this. This is a very flexible program model. We love working with a lot of different providers who come to us with absolutely wonderful proposals targeting all sorts of different young people. And it has really been quite successful and exciting working or creating this program. One of the things that we did last year after Sandy hit in New York City, where there was so much more need across the front on so many areas, we created something called New York City Recovers, which is basically the same program that I just described, but it focuses on Sandy-affected communities in New York City or residents of those communities, and particularly focusing on young people and getting them to sort of participate in the recovery efforts that are going on in New York City. We will be doing a qualitative study of this program this summer to take a look at what participants are experiencing in the program, how they view the program. That's very important to us, that we get their perspective when we are doing evaluation work. We also find it useful in terms of improving the program, and then also to talk to the providers to see what their experiences are and what they might also change with the program. So as I mentioned in an earlier slide, subsidized employment is really part of a three-part strategy that we employ. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other programs that we offer that include a subsidized job and program component, Our young adult literacy program. This is for those young people who are reading between the 4th and 6th grade, the pre-GED level. When we first implemented this program, we were concerned we were going to lose kids to summer distractions, be it summer youth employment or other things over the summer. So we randomly assigned an internship to half the sites to see if that would help with retention, and it did. It increased attendance and had a, as of yet, unexplained effect on increasing numeracy scores. But anyway, it was successful, and so we decided, hey, this is a good strategy, and we incorporated an internship at all of the sites that are operating the program. This program, as well as the next one, the New York City Justice Corps, was also expanded through the Young Men's Initiative. The Justice Corps focuses on court-involved youth. It started as a straight-up workforce development program, really focusing on both restorative justice, the kids must reside in the community where the program is operating, but also on internships and job readiness. And what we found was that so many of the young people coming into the program really were in need of educational skills. They were very much reading at a very, very basic level, and in terms of long-term economic opportunities, et cetera, they really needed education. So we incorporated education into the program model, and now that, along with case management and the subsidized job, the internship, are all the core components. And then Project RISE, which Clyde is going to talk about, is basically our national replication. This is a social innovation fund program, CEO in partnership with the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York City, which is the nonprofit arm of City Hall in New York, was one of the first of 11 intermediaries to win this type of grant. Project RISE is one of 5 programs that we're replicating across the country. It is explicitly for disconnected youth and those that are facing the most barriers. So between 18 and 24, lack a high school diploma or GED, half have to be reading between the 6th and 8th grade reading level at program entry. This is a year-long program. It is an education-conditioned internship, meaning that young people have to participate regularly and have good attendance in the educational services in order to qualify for a paid internship. The program itself is in New York City, Newark, New Jersey, and Kansas City, Missouri, and both FEGS and the Full Employment Council are Project RISE providers, and so clearly can talk more about it, but we're very excited. It builds on the Young Adult Internship program that I referenced earlier, as well as our literacy program, and really taking sort of best practices from both of those. So in terms of next steps, we continue to think about new program models and how we might best serve this population. As I mentioned, lots of investment from CEO in this particular population. We're very interested in building evidence. It's part of our mission. We will be starting a bunch of new evaluations this summer that are related to the Young Men's Initiative. We'll have a couple of evaluations that will be coming out this summer that take a closer look at our subsidized jobs programs, one of which will compare our young adult internship program with the career centers, the basic one-stops that people walk into, to look at differential outcomes and experiences. And then we're also very interested in sharing best practices. We put together a brief that looks at best practices for disconnected youth. It's available on the CEO website and basically looks at subpopulations of disconnected youth, parenting, court involved, low literacy, for an example. It is not meant to be representative, but basically sort of documents lessons that we've learned from CEO programs. And then, of course, we like to host convenings and share our results and all of that. And I'm going to wrap up, I hope, right on time. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions after we're all done presenting. So I'm going to turn it over to Courtney now. Thank you.
Okay. I said I should give a brief pause so that the folks have time to bring up the PowerPoint, but I want to thank everyone for having us here. My name is Courtney Hawkins, and I represent FEGS Health and Human Services. We're a large nonprofit based in New York City. We serve folks in 4 of the 5 boroughs and on Long Island. FEGS was founded in the 1930s as an employment agency with a mission to help individuals who were being discriminated against in the workplace find jobs. And we have since grown to become a large health and human service system with a mission to help individuals achieve the greatest level of independence they can. And we do that across 7 operating divisions, which range from services on the human service side, like housing and employment, to services on the healthcare side, including behavioral health services and services for people with developmental disabilities. And we do that for about 100,000 New Yorkers every year. I'm going to talk about our work in our education programs. We serve about 5,000 young adults each year in New York City in our education programs. And we do that in schools and in a large out-of-school youth center in the South Bronx. And our mission across those programs is really to help young people earn a high school credential, whether that's a diploma or a high school equivalency, transition onto some kind of post-secondary training, and explore the world of work and attach to employment in that process. And we've developed an approach which we call Career Firsts, which basically is a philosophy that services for young adults need to integrate education, comprehensive employment, support services, and youth development. And so we do that across programs that serve on-track high school students, that serve young people who have dropped out of high school or who have fallen behind in high school, or young people who are older and out of the K-12 education system. We modify those services to integrate those 4 key components, but we believe that those 4 key components need to be present in all of our youth development programs. Subsidized employment is a big piece of that, and I'm excited to be here to talk about it. We will have placed about 1,000 young people in subsidized employment over the past year, at the close of this year. And we've learned a lot through that process. We've been doing this work for more than 10 years. And we have some key lessons that we've learned and ways that we've modified our program that I'm excited to share with you. So the critical lessons that I reflect upon when we're looking at our program design and program development is, one, the young people we're serving are faced with multiple barriers and are touched by many systems. And so we're working with youth who are aging out of foster care, we're working with young people who are court involved, we're working with pregnant and parenting teens. And so all of our programs need to be prepared to deal with all of the barriers that young people are facing and help them access services across all the systems that they may be involved in. We know that the growth process for young people is not linear, and so it's always 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and we need to be prepared in our programs to deal with that with young people and be in it for the long haul with them through that process. And related to that, we know that outcome attainment is incremental, so we've had to look very closely at how we measure outcomes to be sure that we're reflecting the small victories for young people over the long-term engagement with them. If we have young people on average coming into our out-of-school youth program who come in wanting to get a high school equivalency, and on average they're reading at the 5th grade level. So we know that that's not going to happen in a year for them, and we need to be able to benchmark their progress towards that high school equivalency and on to college, both for the young person and for our own staff to make sure that our program is effective. We're seeing that even older youth, especially in New York City, have very little prior work experience, and so the young people that used to come to us at 17 and 18 and 19 who have not really held sustained employment are now 23 and 24. And that's impactful. We know in the research it's impactful as the work experience becomes more delayed for them, and it makes the work that we do harder with young people because we're now taking 24-year-olds who have maybe never worked or only worked a few months at a time and try to get them into a career path where they can support themselves and their families. In all of our programs, we know that personal relationships with youth are important, and so we're going to talk about youth development a little bit, and we maintain a primary person model in all of our programs, and that's really core to our philosophy about working with young adults. And we know that opportunities for ongoing support are important, and so in the first panel we heard people talk about braiding funding. We do a lot of that in our out-of-school youth center. We have 26 funding sources to serve about 800 young adults over the course of a year, and that blends government funding and philanthropic funding, and it's important for us to do that so when a young person, quote unquote, finishes one program, they can transition into the next and stay with us through that long-term process. So the 3 components I'm going to talk about today are youth development, case management and primary person, and career development and subsidized work, and how those all integrate together. So across all of our subsidized work programs and all of our youth development programs, we incorporate these 4 pieces of youth development very deliberately. So as I mentioned, every young person has a primary person. We call them youth advisors, and so when a young person comes into our program, they're assigned a mentor and someone who's going to act as a case manager and support them through their time in the program. This is the person who calls them when they're not there, who is there to help them deal with crises they may have in their lives, is there to celebrate their victories, and those people receive a lot of training on how to work with young people and integrate youth development into their work and try to keep a young person sustained in the program. Through our work with CEO, we've started to integrate more group process into our programs, so we've implemented more cohort models of programming where young people are coming in and forming a cohort around their work together, which incorporates education and employment, and we've seen some anecdotal positive response from young people and from the staff about doing that, and so we're looking at integrating that more holistically across all of our programs. We build in opportunities for youth leadership and contribution in our programs. We've developed models where young people, part of their subsidized work experience is to mentor other young people, maybe through college, maybe through a high school equivalency program. And then we also do, community service with young people, taking them out where they pick community service projects and practice them in the field and go back and do presentations in the program after. And then we believe that it's important to let young people explore their passions and interests. So that may be taking young people to see the Mets, and it may be having young people do job shadowing in a Fortune 500 company, but we want to expose young people to lots of different experiences so they can be excited about their futures and refine what makes them feel passionate about what they want to do with the rest of their lives. Our case management approach, as I mentioned, is all structured around the primary person, and so every young person's youth advisor does a comprehensive intake which assesses their strengths and barriers and is an ongoing process. So as I mentioned, none of this is linear with young adults, and so they may come in with 3 barriers and then in 3 months present 3 more. We're seeing a lot of issues with young women becoming pregnant in our program currently, and so we're thinking about how we deal with that. But the case management is key because what we see is young people drop out of the programs as soon as these barriers come up. And so if they don't know explicitly that there's someone there to help them with that, we're likely to lose them. We have lots of partnerships with resource agencies across the city to deal with issues that come up. And the case management really has to be individualized for each young person. There's no one recipe for meeting the needs of one young person of all of our young people, because everyone brings different barriers to the table and different combinations, and we have to be prepared to deal with that. And as I mentioned, it's an ongoing engagement. So in the world of subsidized work, as I mentioned, we do this across all of our programs, both for out-of-school youth and in-school programs. We do both kind of school year programs where young people are entering the program over the course of the year and cohort-based programs. And we've developed what we call scaffolded internship opportunities. And so to really be able to deal with all young people that walk in our door and present them all with work experience opportunities, we've developed what we call sheltered internships, where young people may be working within our agency or working in small groups in the community where they're supervised by a job coach, on through more high-level internships where young people are working independently and they really have work tasks to do, and they become a core component of their workplace team. We really believe philosophically that young people learn to work at work, and so we didn't want to say to a young person that's low-skilled, you have to wait 6 months to improve your skills before you can have a work experience. And so that means that we've had to develop lots of different types of opportunities for young people. And the critical components of our subsidized work model include site visits. So our youth advisors visit young people in their internship sites to talk to their supervisors about how they're doing and to reflect with the young people about what they're learning. We do group learning and reflection activities weekly with young adults that are based on them reflecting on what they're learning with their peers in the workplace, dealing with any challenges they're facing, and helping them overcome the barriers that they may face at work. We have really varied employer relationships, so everything from nonprofit agencies to for-profit companies in a variety of sectors. It's really important to build those relationships across our employers. We have about 250 employer partners now that we work with over the course of the year across the city, and keeping that menu of internship opportunities robust is critical to be able to engage young people. We do training and assessment with our employers to make sure that they're prepared to host young people, and that's an ongoing process. We break up with employers that aren't really invested in creating learning opportunities for young people. And as much as we can, we link the internship to unsubsidized work. So many of our employers will hire young people after they have a successful internship experience. And that's it. So I'm going to turn it over to Clyde to talk a little more. Okay. Thank
you. Good afternoon. I represent the Full Employment Council, which is the fiscal agent and one-stop operator for, for the 2 workforce investment boards that are located in the Kansas City area. Our area covers about 2,800 square miles, about 1 million plus in population, and we're the largest one in the state of Missouri. We service all WREC funded programs and also service a number of TANF programs that we also administer. Our budget is about 40% of formula funds, and then 2/3 of our budget is discretionary funds that we raise. We have a kind of unique system, which is called a Next Generation Career Center model, that basically treats every person that walks in the door as a customer, and we're evaluated whether those persons go to work or not. So you don't have the luxury of moving one person in and out of a program. Everybody who walks in is a part of our performance calculus. And then in addition to that, we also have run a number of demonstration programs in H-1B, healthcare, green jobs, and are presently a part of the HPOG Health Careers Project funded by HHS. HPOG and also some of our other programs also have a very rigorous evaluation standard. HPOG has a control group standard study that we're presently working with right now. And then Project RISE also has a very rigid performance system, evaluation system, along with our own internal MIS system. Keep messing up. One of the subsidized, we got back into the business after, you know, the elimination of the standalone summer youth program. We were able to secure a $5 million TANF program back in June of 2010. And the main reason why we wanted to do that, and that was an agency need, was we needed to get more young males, more minority males interested in our program. Specifically, we'd always had a very heavy female cohort. We had not had very much male involvement. And based upon just some input that we'd done with some of the young people and some of our street recruiters, we developed this project with HHS through the state TANF agency, where we provided $10 an hour to these young people. And also we serviced about 2,500 of them, 60% of them being male. So automatically we went from a 35% male requirement or participation rate to about 60%. We said, you know, what was the deal with it? Well, one thing we knew, that the wage itself was very important. $10 an hour was very important. A lot of these young people are in debt. They got DUNs. And the debt can be in the term of a loan, could be in the term of a bad debt, or could be a child support case. And in Missouri, they can't take but up to half of your salary. So if they took half, they still end up with $5 an hour. So that was enough to get them to come in and participate in the program. The second program that we funded, which was a little bit twist on the first, now we got their interest. What's the other thing that we can do to engage education? Was one that we were funded through the Department of Energy, and we called it G.R.E.A.T, Green Reemployment and Training Program. And in this particular program, not only did we do the internship or subsidized work experience, but we also combined it with a credential training course through the University of Central Missouri. And what they did was they got a lead abatement certification, they got a customer service certification, and then they went out in teams of 10. So this was a cohort-based, team-oriented project. We had crew leaders that was led by an adult assistant crew leader that got an additional $11 an hour in pay. And then we had a reflection period at the end of every project where they tried to make sense of the project and what they did. So they did stuff like they GPSed all the neighborhoods, identified all the hot spots. They did even imaging of some of the neighborhoods to try to identify population centers. This project then transitioned, many of the young persons then, once we had finished that, transitioned to the Career Center activities to secure adult training or education programs. The next project, which was funded locally, was 100% privately funded, was by local football teams, the Kansas City Chiefs, who are great philanthropists. We're trying to get their football caliber up to their philanthropy. And the Kansas City Royals was in the same boat. But they basically funded as a part of the construction of the stadiums, which we built in our area, made a commitment to try to do more to help the employment of our community since we're all paying for it through a sales tax increase. Set up a $400,000 fund, which we call Earn and Learn. It combines an internship with a $3,000 scholarship in a field related to professional athletics in the back office. So it could be healthcare, it could be construction, it could be security, but we provide them a scholarship to a community college or four-year institution. And we've been able to not only get that scholarship, but also leverage it with Pell Grants, which means we could service almost double the number of people in that particular project. But probably the most innovative one that has had the most, I would say, results in terms of education gains and completion rates has been Project RISE, which is an 18-week internship. But by the way, it's the longest-term internship we've ever had. And even though the wage is not $10 an hour, the length of the internship was very important. There's a cohort-based group. In other words, you start off with a class of 25 or 30, and that's what you end up with. The attrition rate, you can't backfill or anything of that sort. But it's very good to create a new peer group for these young people, particularly given the fact that we're trying to get them into a whole phase of promoting education for employment. And a lot of times, some of the generational aspects of that serve as a barrier. Third, the program is a combination of GED, work experience, community service, case management, and youth work in public, private, and nonprofit work sites. And we have both GED and non-GED tracks. For a high school diploma, we work with a charter high school that services dropouts, and they provide both a GED and non-GED option. The GED option is one, interesting, we have an arrangement with the Kansas City, Missouri School District where they assign credit to our site, but we hire our own instructor. One of the things that we found out was that all the GED instructors, 60% of them were on a contract. They didn't have benefits or things of that sort. A lot of them were retired. We hired our instructor full-time, put him on a performance-based contract, gave him bonuses for performance. And the net result is we probably feel we got one. She was named the GED Teacher of the Year for the district last year. Has excellent results. Is about 5'4" and is a dynamo. And the other thing that we found is that the number of the graduates that we have score the highest scores in the GED in the district. One LGBT graduate received the highest score in the state for her particular test cycle. They all are provided one way or the other through a Pell Grant through WREC, a scholarship to go to a community college or vocational school, no questions asked. We'll move mountains to make sure they have one. And our GED instructor is one that we trot around to many of our other educational partners to give best lessons and insights on how to do this. The superintendent of the schools and charter schools, sometimes there's tension between them and the regular school district, and the GED site attends all of our sites, graduations, is very engaged and many of our participants of RISE serve as ambassadors to recruit other young people. We have found that model, the lessons learned from that particular model is the combination of education and employment. We combine it with labor market information, enables them to make better decisions about going to school, but a lot of them have defaulted on a lot of loans and things of that sort, or had participated in some type of, and I say loan, I mean consumer loans, because the payday lending, it wreaked havoc with a lot of these young people. The other thing is a lot of them are homeless, and I did not have a degree understanding of how many young people couch surf. A lot of them are surfing from place to place, and they plan it out for a whole 6 months where they're going to sleep at different houses. And a lot of these kids are not always poor. Some of these kids get kicked out by their parents. The other thing that was astonishing to me was the amount of hunger. These kids aren't eating. So we had to do things like bring healthy snacks, because what they do, I had to kill all the candy bars because they were stripping my candy bar machines naked. They come in and that'd be the first thing they grab. So we started having healthy snacks, fruit, and things of that sort. The GE teacher called it brain food. But a lot of them are extremely not nutritious. So we're going to try to petition one of our local foundations for a whole healthy nutritional guide program to combine it with these young people. But we found all of those to be very important. Also, RISE has a very strong technical assistance component. We use a lot of the interaction that we share with some of our friends from New York. One thing that we did add in closing was we did have to have a gender-based component for both the men and the young women, because there are certain things you need to tell guys, you don't need to tell them in front of women, and there's some things you need to tell women, you don't need to be told in front of guys. That created a level of bonding and retention that enabled us to promote this whole concept of lifelong learning and development, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this without PowerPoint. That's a shocking thing for me. And I'm going to try to react to a little bit of what I heard, but I thought I'd say a couple of big picture things first. So the first thing is, when I'm on Amtrak trains, I catch up on all those articles that pile up on your desk and you never get a chance to read. So I was on an Amtrak train yesterday, and I read a very relevant article to this it was Peter Edelman and Harry Holzer, and it was talking about where youth are in terms of school and work now compared to 1979, which was a very different time. And the thing that I had people talk a lot about the decline in youth employment, and there's been a lot of stuff written about that. What I hadn't seen presented quite this way before is they looked at all young people 16 to 24 who don't have a post-secondary credential, so sort of less educated young people. And back in 1979, basically a quarter of them were enrolled full-time in education, and half of them were not full-time in education but were working. Now, when you look now, even a little bit before the Great Recession, but also now, the proportions are exactly flipped. Half of them are enrolled full-time in education, and a quarter of them are working. And it's a very different economy. And I mean, on the one hand, you could think of that as being a good thing because lots more people are in school, and a lot of that is post-secondary education. There could be another panel about the fact that they're not actually finishing post-secondary degrees. So, we could talk about that another time. But I just was thinking about the fact that this is such a different labor market and such a different set of activities that young people this age are doing, that we just need to think creatively about how we're using very limited resources for subsidized employment, because these are expensive programs, in a context where, it used to be that what kids really needed to do was learn how to work, and there were jobs out there that didn't require a huge amount of formal education, and if you could learn to work, you could move into a job that paid pretty well, and this is not true in most places anymore. And so, how are we going to use subsidized employment strategically? And I think that's, when you think about the programs that are emerging that people talked about today, I think that's reflecting that, where subsidized employment is part of a package of some kind that includes educational activities, that includes all sorts of other things that are I think, reflecting that sort of big change. This is only a 30-year period, and I was really surprised to see how big that change was. The other thing I thought, just a quick review of research evidence in this area. So subsidized employment programs in general for adults or youth, I think you could say they have two very broad goals. One is just to, when jobs are scarce, in a bad labor market, you want to put money in people's pockets. That's just one goal of, think of the WPA, or on a much smaller scale, a lot of the TANF emergency fund programs. There weren't a lot of jobs. You wanted to get income support to people. The other thing, though, is to use subsidized employment as a learning tool, a developmental kind of program that helps people learn how to work. Most youth programs, I think, are in that latter category. They have much, more of a developmental goal. And they're also used, I think Carson mentioned this, to, engage young people in a program that has other things in it besides work. And I think that logic model makes a lot of sense for young people who are brand new to the labor market, and what you're trying to do is give people an opportunity to learn by working. The research evidence on this approach, though, from real, rigorous evaluations is surprisingly thin. There's some really old studies. National Supported Work Demonstration in the 1970s was a work experience program that one of the populations was high school dropouts. The results were not that great in terms of long-term outcomes after the subsidized jobs finished. There was another 70s project called the Youth Incentive Entitlement Pilot Projects, which is amazing in today's context, where in a number of cities, a federally funded project guaranteed jobs to every young person who, on the condition that they stay in school or go back to school if they were out of school, and it gave jobs to something like 75,000 young people. Very dramatic results in terms of increasing employment rates, eliminated the disparity in employment rates between black and white young people in those cities. But again, we don't know much about the long-term effects, partly because the Reagan administration came into office and eliminated the program before the long-term follow-up could be done. There's a project called that MDRC did called Career Academies, which is sort of relevant, which is a actually a high school reform, but it includes work-based learning opportunities connected to high school. And we did this evaluation and followed people for 8, 10, 12 years and found that people who had been in these career academies had significantly higher earnings than people who hadn't, particularly for young men, many years later. And the suspicion is that it had something to do with some of these work-based learning opportunities that people had while in high school. And there are a few studies that are underway. I think we'll be learning a lot more about subsidized employment programs for youth through the YAIP, the YAIP evaluation that both Carson and Erica mentioned. We're in the middle of an evaluation of Youth Build, which is a model that includes, I think you could call it a subsidized employment model, but there's a lot more to it than that. And then another project that we're hoping to bring into this STEAD evaluation that Erica talked about is an interesting program in Chicago that targets kids who are coming out of incarceration, either in the juvenile or the adult system, because it's a wide age range. And it uses a very interesting sort of comprehensive model that mixes subsidized employment, education, and something they call social emotional learning, which is sort of it's almost like a cognitive behavioral therapy kind of approach. And they're sort of merging all that together into a program that engages kids full-time for about a year. So it's a very elaborate program. On the adult side, the evidence is actually not that great, to be honest, about using, for example, transitional jobs as a strategy to try to improve long-term employment outcomes for guys coming out of prison or TANF recipients. We've done a number of random assignment evaluations of TJ programs. Long-term employment outcomes in most cases have not improved. So people who had access to a transitional job a year or two later were not more likely to be working than people who didn't. The programs that we're testing right now through STEAD and the Labor Department Parallel Project all do something different than the transitional jobs programs that we studied before. And some of the stuff that they do different is actually reflected in what you heard about here. And so I want to turn to two things that come directly from the presentations, just two quick observations. One is a point that I think both Carson and Courtney mentioned about this being a diverse population and there being different models of subsidized employment and how you match models to people. So for example, if you think of a spectrum of subsidized employment interventions, all the way on one end you could have a program that's more sheltered, as you talked about. The jobs are not in the real labor market. They're surrounded by lots of supports. All the way on the other end, and then sort of somewhere in the middle, you could maybe have an internship type of program where people are working maybe in a private employer, but there's really not an expectation that the private employer will hire them at the end. It's more about learning. And then all the way, and keep going, you could think of like an OJT-like model, where you're putting somebody into a job, you're subsidizing a private employer, and there's a hope that they'll actually roll over and become a permanent employee of that company. And then you have young people, at all different stages. And it seems to me the challenge is getting, you're using these programs to, not just to match people, but to actually change their trajectories. So the instinct is always, I'm going to take the most so I have to work with a private employer, and they're going to want to, people who are fairly work ready. So I'm going to take my, higher end young people and put them into that program. And that makes sense. The key is, don't put people into a subsidized employment program who can get a job without a subsidy, because that's not a good use of the resources. And don't put people in the super intensive sheltered program that's very expensive, who could be one step up on the ladder because they don't need to start with that. And it's a really hard thing, and and I think what Courtney talked about a little bit is having people move through a program at their own pace, and so you can sort of try to match them through their actual experience in the program. And if you start somebody in something that's more intensive maybe than they need, they can move out of it more quickly into something else that has a little less support and is maybe a little less expensive. So that whole issue of sort of targeting and matching people with programs when you have these different levels of models seems to me a really interesting programmatic question and also evaluation question. The other thing is, what struck me listening to these presentations is how, when you really drill down and think about what the kind of logic model is of these programs, like what it is that they're trying to achieve and how, it's really complicated. You think of subsidized employment, you stick people in a subsidized job, they learn to work, they'll be able to get a job. And it's so much more complicated than that. I mean, some of the things I heard mentioned was people are learning to work through working. Subsidized employment is engaging people in a program that's also partly about education. It's about engaging them in a program where they're going to make contacts with adults who care about them and can guide them and mentor them. It may be like in this Chicago program, engaging them in a program that also has a structured curriculum around social emotional learning and learning things like impulse control and decision making. And then I also heard, I think Clyde was talking about peer support as another element of what these programs are doing. So it's really interesting, it's really complicated, and it also means to me, as an evaluation person, and I think this also applies to programs, is what outcomes are you measuring? These programs are not always even intended to have somebody in working happily in an unsubsidized job a year after the program. That's not, first of all, it's not a reasonable goal in some cases, but in other cases, you might hope that, well, maybe they'd be back in school. Maybe the work experience actually re-engaged them and stimulated them to think about what they want to do with their lives, and they went back to school. Or maybe you want to be measuring some of these kind of cognitive, what they call, I guess they call them non-cognitive skills. I don't know what that means because it implies that it's not your brain, I guess. But you know, these kind of more social and emotional skills that people learn in programs, and they're hard to measure. And in the STEAD project, actually, we have developed an entirely new survey module to try to use in these youth-oriented programs to try to measure stuff that's not just about, are they working in an unsubsidized job, but what are their attitudes and expectations about, you know, their lives going forward. So those are just a couple of sort of random thoughts coming out of the presentations.
Well, thank you. I think you guys did not disappoint. So we have, luckily, this is unusual. It's rare that you actually have a lot of time for questions. So we have about 20 minutes for questions for folks who are here, for folks who are watching via live stream. You know, I did just want to also point out that we've talked a little bit about our subsidized and transitional employment demonstration. We are also looking at, you could consider it youth subsidized employment in our ISIS evaluation, which I'm sure some of you may have heard about yesterday. But we are evaluating the scale-up of the Year-Up program, which is a year-long program that provides 6 months of training in the IT or finance sector and then places participants in a 6-month paid internship in one of those two sectors. And they've had some early evaluation work done that was very promising, so we've included it in our ISIS evaluation in 9 sites around the country and are looking forward to those results as well. So I think a lot of exciting work going on in evaluation, as you heard here. I mean, it's a research conference, so we like to provide research findings, and I think the sort of highlight is stay tuned. I think we could have this same panel in a few more years and have a lot of really interesting things to talk about. So with that, we have a question.
Yes, hi, my name is Chiquita Crawford. I'm an independent advocate in the state of Maryland for children with special needs and for youth. And I'm on a couple of boards for people that are transitioning from school, outside of school for whatever they're going to do when they leave school, whether it be work or going to college or whatever the case might be. So I am so excited to hear all of the things that you are doing. My initial question was for Carson, but then when I heard the rest of the people speak, it actually pertains to each of you. So when I heard the age, the reading level requirements for your different programs, I start to wonder if, in fact, in the different districts that you all have done your research in, if they had decided to change or to do something different in the school districts to try to up the level of reading because of the programs that you're researching in, to make sure that the people that are in that school district kind of can read a little bit better now so they can be in either your program or other programs or either just for life in general. Because I know in Baltimore we are doing a different program to try to increase not just reading but other curricula for our young people because of the same or similar programs or issues that we're finding.
I'll take the first shot at answering. So I'm not, I can't obviously speak for the New York City Department of Education, so I can't talk about what they may be doing specifically to improve literacy skills. But one thing that is going on that affects more than just simply New York City is the shift to the Common Core and increasing academic standards, which you're probably familiar with. So this has a lot of impact. not only for in-school youth, but for our out-of-school youth who are reading at much lower levels, and then the gap essentially between where they are and where they need to get is going to be ever increasing. And this, of course, is starting to roll out now and will be going forward in the new GED or high school equivalency exam. While I'm not sure, so clearly there's a change in the schools, there is also a change in programming outside of schools that affects not only the programs that we have talked about here. I've heard very often about the need for professional development for teachers so that they can also teach and make sure that they are able to meet these higher standards. And I'm speaking outside of the actual schools themselves, but for instructors of GED classes, et cetera. So it's a very important issue, and I think a good one that you raised. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would just add, so we provide programs in schools, and we're seeing the shifts that Carson's talking about in our schools. I think, to your point, though, what we've realized is that, especially where we are in the South Bronx, there will always be a group of young people who are reading at very low levels, who have disengaged from school very early on, whether by formally dropping out or just not going. And that many of these young people don't have opportunities to engage in programs because there are reading level thresholds that are required for them to enter. And so we have deliberately tried to raise funding to be able to serve young people at all reading levels. So they may not be able to go into Project Rise, but we will have other programs for them to get them from the 3rd grade level to the 5th grade level, or to the 5th grade level to the 9th grade level, or wherever they need to be. And it's important because we hear from young people that they go to programs and they're told they can't start because they're not reading at a higher enough level, but at this point they're 22, and where should they go? And so we've believe very passionately in that, and continue to do advocacy to ensure that that funding is in place so that we can move people along the trajectory.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. As Carson mentioned, the whole GED change, the Common Core, and then just the basic lack of funding for adult education literacy programs has dropped significantly. The thing that we are doing is we are publicizing as much we can the results for, we call them comeback kids, because there's an assumption that once you become 18, 19, 20 years of age, that you are too old to be able to achieve grade level gains. We've seen them go from 6th grade in Carson's program, half the people had to be at 6th grade. We've seen young people go from 6th grade to the 12th grade to 11th grade with a very intensive remedial program. To the point that people thought they were learning disabled, and they weren't. They were just not interested. The teachers were not that. Secondly, as I mentioned before, a lot of these persons who are teaching GED and literacy programs, either volunteers or contract staff, and quite frankly, they do not have the type of support they need to provide the real thing. So it can be done. It is not an impossible dream, but we just have to publicize it because there is this big debate that goes on in this country now as to whether or not if you don't get them early enough, you write them off because they're too old. And that's just a paradigm that we refuse to accept.
I agree, and I think that what you're doing is so important also because it helps the self-esteem of the parents eventually when they start having the children. You mentioned that some of them were having children and dropping off, but if they can read, they can help the children that they're having with their homework and other things and won't feel so bad and have a generation of children dropping out of school because they can't read. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Hi, my name is Allegra Bader from the Center for Community Change. Thank you. This was a great panel. I had some questions about the employers that you choose and what is the difference between public sector and private employers. I was wondering if any of the private employers actually contribute to the wages. And if there are private sector employers who are not hiring workers after they finish their internships, do you have a way of finding that out, and do you then look for different employers? And my final question was for New York. I was curious, what is the actual wage that you're paying, and are there any benefits? Thank you.
So I think that both Clyde and Courtney can talk a little bit about the employers specifically. We typically, with our programs, do not request that the employer put it in a match, but it would be great if they did, as I'm sure these guys would. It also doesn't often, I mean, it's unemployment insurance can be, a benefit, but not health benefits. I'm not sure which specifically you're referring to. On the wage front, typically, it is minimum wage. One of the things that we have spent a lot of time thinking about is what is the appropriate wage for somebody who does not have a GED or high school diploma. Clearly, there's a need for money, but are they really realistically going to be able to get a, say, $10 or $12 paying job if they don't have those credentials? So most of our programming is at minimum wage. In New York, it's $7.25. For those that may have some of these credentials, then we certainly would entertain paying higher wages. There is law now that will take effect sometime, I think, in this coming year that will be increasing the minimum wage in New York City, which is a good thing.
So can I just ask a quick follow-up question on that? If they're placed with an employer who pays higher wages, are they doing comparable work, and how do you deal with that issue?
So for the cases for the young people who are coming in with a GED or some other credential that would pay higher wages, yes, they are often given greater responsibility or supervisory work, something that would correlate essentially with a higher wage. But the skills that are involved in the employment itself or the subsidized job are of a slightly higher level than for those who are coming in without those credentials and getting the minimum wage.
Yes, we treat, I think Dan talked about it earlier, we look at the objective for each person. For example, some employers, some for-profit employers would not be appropriate for the person who's trying to develop a work ethic, and that's the only thing that we're doing. So we will place them in a nonprofit or some type of nurturing type of relationship that doesn't have the profit motive on their back. Some we feel we do need to transition to work. We will put them in that environment, and we sign an agreement with them to that effect. In terms of the wage we pay, it depends a lot of times on is there a union there, which we make sure that we work with that union to make sure that it is not something that creates a problem. And in that case, we pay whatever there's an agreement about, and that's probably for more advanced persons. But we sign a worksite agreement with every employer that we work with for-profit employers. We have a memorandum of understanding, and we typically go based upon what's appropriate in that for-profit environment, or if it's a not-for-profit environment, we have two-way feedback, and we'll typically combine an education component with it. For those employers that exploit the system, we'll find that out real quick, and we'll take them out of it. So they just won't be a host agency anymore, but typically they won't because we've already done an inspection. We've checked to make sure that they're safe, there's ADA accessible, and those types of things. And that's typically that we do before any employer that we work with. And then they understand, too, what the expectation is, so they aren't going into it blind. But we found that a lot of them are open to it if you have them, and we categorize them. Here's a developmental person, here's a transition to work employer, and we categorize the people in the same way.
I would add two things. I mean, because the young people that we're working with are generally young people without a high school equivalency and no work experience, what's happened in New York City is even the most basic entry-level jobs in New York require those two things, right? So I used my friends at Burlington Coat Factory as an example. They did a recent store opening that we staffed through our workforce center, and they required 6 months experience in a high school equivalency for an entry-level cashier job, right? And so what that's doing is it's pushing these young people out of the workplace. And so what sometimes we're able to do with a work internship is get them in to do an internship, which will then, the employer will say, I know this kid, I'm willing to take the risk, and then I'll hire them into this entry-level job that before they didn't have the qualifications for. So that's one piece. I think the other piece that I thought of in Dan's comments is we're really working on structuring the internships around skill development, not about just doing a job, right? And so placing young people in the place where they're going to develop the skills that they need to develop along the spectrum that will help them to be more employable and more successful in the workplace. And so the match for them, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, is really about where they're going to be able to develop those skills. So if it's soft skills like work ethic and, interpersonal relationship with your employer, there are a scope of work sites that are able to work with young people around those issues. Then there may be harder skills that just qualify them for an entry-level job, right? And then there are more advanced skills that are for young people who are maybe in a post-secondary program or something like that. And so we're focused more on what the skill development is and figuring out how to quantify that and set those goals with young people, as opposed to just the job experience itself, if that makes sense. And that's hard. It's hard to evaluate, it's hard to implement, but it's kind of, for us as a program, the next developmental step and where we are in ensuring that these are really learning experiences for young people, because it isn't that they're just going to stay in that job for the next 20 years based on this one work experience that they had.
One value that we also promote with this is that there is a training agreement between us and the employer, the host agency, that's signed off by the person. And we also promote this to the young people as a way to get a reference. So even if the employer does not hire them, is not able to or does not, if there was a good work experience, that can be that person's reference that they use. And a lot of times that will get them another job at a place that is hiring if that experience has been successful.
One thought, this whole focus on subsidized jobs in private companies is, there's always been OJT programs, but they're small, but they've been around for a long time. I think under the WREC, and TANF Emergency Fund, a lot of that subsidized employment activity was going on in private employers. And it always seems to me one of the issues is to try really hard to make sure that that you're getting something in return for the subsidy. So either the employer is creating a job that wasn't there before, or at least if it's not a new job, they're providing some training or they're doing something that's not just a pure windfall. Just basically taking somebody they would have hired anyway and now getting a subsidy for it. And it's a challenge in program design, I think, to make sure that happens. And it's just an interesting development, because so much of the subsidized employment, so much more of it, the subsidized employment activity now is happening in the private sector as opposed to like public service employment, which we used to have decades ago.
Thank you.
This is a question for Dan. You mentioned the results of previous studies of subsidized employments for adults and how they had not been very promising, but it sounds like you're quite hopeful about these programs as well as other new adult subsidized programs, and I wondered if that's true, what the differences are?
I'm always hopeful. Doing this for so long. No, I mean, the models that we're testing now are different in some ways. So what we tested before are basically transitional jobs programs where people, were placed for 3 or 4 months in a job, sometimes in a community-based organization, sometimes in like a Goodwill type of, social enterprise organization. And then the program tried to use those few months of work experience to then get the person placed into an unsubsidized job. It didn't seem like the experience of having done that transitional job improved people's employability very much. It may be because they weren't targeting exactly the right people. That may have been part of the problem. But the programs we're looking at now do a couple of things that are different than that. One is some of them look I think they look a little bit like what Courtney was talking about. I'm not exactly sure I understood your model exactly, but they have tiers of different kinds of subsidized jobs and try to move people through a different kind, through tiers, with the last tier being actually in a private job where they can roll over and become a permanent employee. And if you can do that right, it's really hard to do, I'm sure you would tell us, but if you can do that right, maybe you can deal with that transition problem where you're trying to move from a subsidized job that's not a real job and then turn that into an unsubsidized job. So some of the programs look kind of like that. Another different model is to try to use the subsidized job to, in a broader context of a program that includes something like, training opportunities or other things attached to it. The TJ programs that we looked at before, although they did provide sort of social services help, they didn't have, much else in terms of skill development as part of them. So those are just a couple of examples of things that may work differently. And then I think the other thing is targeting, and really just trying to make sure that you're targeting programs to people who can't, get the thing you're offering on their own. Because if they can get it on their own, it's not a wise use of money. So those are some of the reasons why I'm hoping things will be better this time around.
Hi, actually, two questions. One, you mentioned the GED changes, and when you're talking about subsidized employment programs for youth that are explicitly including a GED component that takes a long time, and there are a lot of different components, what do these changes mean for retention and keeping youth engaged if they've been working to something that all of a sudden is about to shift, and they haven't completed all the tests yet? And so I think sort of Courtney and Clyde, I think you can both speak to that. The second question I had was more for Clyde. You mentioned child support and the degree to which wage withholding is a real barrier to getting folks to even buy into the program. And you talk about that 50% cap, and I guess I was wondering the extent to which you've actually had interactions with the child support agency and thinking through if there are lower wage withhold amounts for guys with child support orders as a means to get them engaged with the hope of long-term increases in payments. So, thank you.
Well, that's a really good question about these changes in the GED and what it means for the young people. So currently in New York, and I imagine in other places as well, there's a huge push to get young people to get their GED before the change happens, and particularly focusing on what they call partial passers, people who have passed components of the GED. I think a lot is still up in the air in terms of what we don't know about when this actually, gets implemented and the number of slots and how long it is actually going to take these low-level readers who are reading at the 4th grade reading level to get to a point where they would be ready to sit for the GED. But I can imagine that given the shift to the Common Core, the length of time is going to be substantially longer than it perhaps currently is. And then I think, given that, we're going to need to really do everything we can to ensure retention, because as we know, so many of our young people come in thinking, I can get the GED within 6 weeks, and they're just not ready, and sort of not only managing expectations, but making sure that the interim milestones and progress points that they're making are acknowledged, and then whether it be through internships, incentives for reading gains, et cetera, ensuring that they can stick through it, because it may well take 2 years where it took a year or something like that. Thank you.
I would just add that I think it speaks to the need to create a parallel path around career development that is long and that has levels, so that as young people are moving up in their educational program, there's also an opportunity for them to move up in the career development program. And so one thing I think we've seen that has not been successful is we have some programs where young people can do internships for an entire school year. And so that could be 30 weeks. And when a young person is in a work experience for that long, that's kind of flat, that's not focused on skill development and movement up kind of a scaffold of internship, what we see is that the learning isn't as robust and it's not as meaningful for them. And so we're trying to think about how we can take those lessons and build movement in an internship program that will allow for long-term engagement and ensure that a young person's kind of work development skills are progressing as their academic skills are progressing. It's a lot of moving parts for a program to figure out how to put together, and a lot of it will depend on, I think, when we see what the test is. Now that we know what the test is in New York, when we see what it looks like and how this rolls out, will impact our program in case management, in career development, in academic services. All of those pieces are going to be affected.
I would say the same thing. The whole aspect about the GED transition is that we just have to manage the change with the young people. So, we're there with them. We're talking to the GED, so whatever it is, at least it won't be thrust upon them and they don't feel like they've, done something in vain, or they changed, because the main thing is they're changing the rules on me again, I'm finna get screwed. That's typically what happens. A lot of people, they don't understand the change, so we're there with them and we're gonna manage it through them or whatever the circumstance is. In terms of the whole issue of the child support, yeah, I think the one thing that we have done with this model, in the Project Rise component, over 55% of the kids that we work with, young people that we work with, have had exposure to the criminal justice system. So that's given us a whole, and because of the success rate, I'm now talking with the prosecutors, the family courts, the drug courts, and things like that I had talked to, quite frankly, for years back because I didn't have anything to talk about with them. So now we have what I think is a meaningful program that has good results. And I think in that way, we can try to negotiate with them a little bit differently. Let's approach this differently. Let's don't let people feel so completely out of sync, because it is a big issue for some of these young people. Because when it was $8 or $7, I said, well, you know what? For $3.50 an hour, what I'm going to net, I'm going to go do what I'm doing. And it's not worth it. Or, you know, why do I need to even do those things? So that's very important to the psyche of these young people. So now I think we have something that'll give the courts and the legal side of the child support team something that they can say, okay, I see this has some value and it is a meaningful program. It's not just referral to some type of job, quote, shift counseling deal. There's actually somewhere they can get education and employed. So we have been engaged in contacts with them that have had good results as a back end of it.
Well, this has been a really, I think, rich discussion and a terrific panel. I think maybe everyone should come back in 2014 and 2015 and hear about the exciting research findings. So I want to thank everyone here. I also want to thank our viewers online. I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and we hope to see you back at 1:15 for the next session here. And with that, I hope everyone has a great lunch. So please join me in thanking everybody here. Thank you.